So he's saying that the fiercest fighting that they're doing right now is happening right here.
ماشي دagaalku culus ka dhacay waa naga horeysay Soomaa.
The men fired across the rooftops, but it didn't make sense to me what we were doing here, or what the Americans were doing here in Somalia, arming this warlord turned general for what seemed like a senseless war.
That's our next guest's new and timely documentary based on his investigation of America's expanding covert counterterrorism missions in Afghanistan, Yemen, Somalia, and elsewhere. He's no stranger to going after the U.S. military complex. His 2007 bestseller, Blackwater, The Rise of the World's Most Powerful Mercenary Army, helped expose the industry of military contractors and even led Blackwater to change its name. Now he turns his attention to how many of our current wars are off the books and asks, is fighting dirty the new normal? Interestingly, the provocative doc is coming out as that new NBC News Wall Street Journal poll finds a strong majority of Americans continue to support the drone program. Joining us now is investigative journalist and the producer and subject of this award-winning documentary, Dirty Wars, Jeremy Scahill. It will open, the movie, in select cities nationwide this Friday. Thanks for being here.
Great to be with all you guys.
So let's start with what we just saw on camera there in Somalia and also other countries outside of Afghanistan and Iraq. How many other countries do we have these operations going in, and what are these wars if they're not authorized?
Well, I mean, I think these operations are happening in several dozen countries. You know, there are U.S. Special Operations Forces deployed in 75 to 100 countries around the world on any given day. And, you know, a lot of what they're doing is working with other countries' militaries, doing training exercises. But the cases that I think are really important for us to focus on is when they're involved with what's called kinetic operations and unilateral operations. In other words, when they're doing targeted kill operations or they're doing snatch and grab operations in countries outside of the declared battlefield of Afghanistan. And, you know, what I found in my investigation in Somalia, you know, you're showing that clip. I'm walking around with this warlord named Inda Ade, who interestingly had been one of the guys who was sheltering the 1998 embassy bombers, the guys who blew up the U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. Wow. And he's been flipped to the U.S. side, and now he's working with the United States in targeting the militant group Al-Shabaab, which pledged its allegiance to Al-Qaeda. And you know, so what the U.S. is doing in Somalia right now is effectively outsourcing the kill program to these warlords, some of whom had been allies of Al-Qaeda in a previous lifetime, and they're now running around with these kill lists and you know, in a band of men hunting down people, in some cases names that the Americans have given them, in other cases people they just suspect of being Islamic radicals.
Jeremy, I want to thank you for coming on and really admire your work. There's been some criticism and controversy, warranted in my opinion, over the so-called kill-capture program for failing to capture as often as it kills. You've said that al-Awlaki, for example, might have been able to have been captured rather than killed. What would you say to the folks who say, look, these are bad guys, why shouldn't we just shoot them when we can?
Well, according to who are they bad guys? I mean, one of the things that we've seen under President Obama is the expansion of what are called signature strikes, this idea that you're engaged in pre-crime, like Minority Report, where we are targeting people based on a pattern of life. We don't necessarily know their identities. We don't necessarily have any evidence or intelligence to suggest that they're involved with real terror plots or criminal activity aimed at the United States, and we're preemptively just going in and killing them. And I'm terribly concerned about that. And, you know, I mean, I guess maybe I'm crazy to think that we actually should abide by our Constitution and our principles and believe in a system where we present evidence against people that before we give them the death penalty. There's no doubt that there are nefarious individuals plotting on any given day to try to blow up U.S. airplanes or poison U.S. water supplies. For me as an American, my question is, what's the most effective way to address those threats? Pre-crime attacks, in my opinion, are going to encourage more radicalization and potentially bring greater harm or threats to our society.
Well, and Jeremy, as you know, on May 23rd, the president gave a major counterterrorism speech. He talked sort of about signature strikes. There was some indication that there might be a willingness to change that policy, that policy may already be changing. Out of that speech as a whole, though, was there any major policy shift or approach shift that really struck you that you thought was important?
Well, I mean, here, I think you have, you know, the fact that President Obama is a constitutional law expert and clearly is a very careful, deliberative guy. I think he's trying to sort of have it both ways. I think part of what we heard in that speech was what President Obama wants the truth to be or the reality to be. And then part of it was a pretty forceful defense of the idea that the United States does believe it has the authority to conduct targeted killings, I would say assassination operations, in basically any country where it determines there's a threat to, now the new phrase is U.S. persons. So I think he was trying to give the impression that we're going to narrow the scope of this. But when you talk to people behind the scenes, the president's speech is one thing. The signature strike policy certainly is going to continue on in Pakistan for at least the next 2 years. And in Yemen, there's indications that there were signature strikes after he gave that speech. So, I mean, I think you're looking at a commander-in-chief who's sort of caught between his old self prior to becoming the president and then his new set of responsibilities where he's constantly being bombarded with information from the generals or the CIA that there are these threats around the world. And I think that, I think he's sincere. I just think that the policy is misguided, and ultimately I think it's going to cause blowback.
Well, it was actually remarkable to me in that speech how he grappled with that in a public way that he hadn't done before. But what about the specific change in that speech, moving the targeted strike operation from the CIA more to DOD?
Yeah, I mean, this is interesting. It's been pushed that sort of John Brennan is portrayed in some news accounts as being this like priest-like figure, and that he and Obama are sort of like the Jesuits huddled around discussing the just war theory or something. But in reality, I think part of this is a dog and pony show. The military already is running its own drone program parallel to the CIA. Air Force pilots are the people that are sitting in those control centers in the southwest of the United States, piloting these aircraft that are being used to bomb Pakistan or Yemen or in some cases Somalia. And not to get too insider baseball with this, but to me the question is, are these going to be conducted under Title 10 of the U.S. Code or Title 50? Title 10 would mean that it's a military operation and would bring all of the structures of accountability that come with military operations. If they're conducted under Title 50, which means that it could be a covert operation, it's an intelligence operation, that means that the U.S. role can continue to be shielded and kept classified. And so for me, the real issue is not whether it's CIA or military. The military is already deeply involved with it. It's how are they going to present it to Congress? Is the Senate Intelligence Committee going to have actual legitimate oversight functions, or are we going to continue to see this sort of stonewalling where only a handful of senators can see a handful of memos?
I'm curious, Jeremy, as to how you think we should be doing this. If you were the commander-in-chief in charge and entrusted with keeping Americans safe, and your legacy is on the line and all those sort of things, how do you prosecute this war? You can't say no violence at all, no warfare at all. We have to do something to stop the many people who you concede are trying to hurt us every single day. So what is the long-term and short-term strategy for keeping us safe?
Right. I mean, I believe that we, like all nations around the world, have a right to self-defense. And I think that, the president in his speech made an analogy when he was defending the killing of American citizen Anwar al-Awlaki. He likened al-Awlaki to a sniper pointing his weapon at a crowd of innocent civilians and implied that if the United States didn't take him out, that there was going to be a terrorist attack against the United States. I've seen a lot of evidence to suggest that Anwar al-Awlaki was a reprehensible individual. And there's a lot of smoke around him regarding the underwear bomber and other totally nefarious, bad people. But I think that the president should have presented evidence that al-Awlaki was in fact an operational member. And the fact is that
they did present evidence, Jeremy. You know that in a Yemeni court.
No, what was the evidence, Toure?
Well, I mean, I don't have it here in front of me, but he was convicted. He was convicted in a Yemeni court.
Would you want to be prosecuted in a Yemeni court? This is a country that set up a tribunal to prosecute journalists for crimes against the dictator. If you're holding up the Yemeni justice system as a place where you think an American citizen is going to get a fair trial, then I would invite you to go to Yemen and start jaywalking and see what kind of treatment you're going to get in those courts, because you can't have it both ways, man. If you want to act like Yemen's courts are legitimate, you better act like they're legitimate when they put political prisoners in there or they put people in there for crimes against a dictatorship. So don't come at me with something about a Yemeni court. This was an American citizen who should have had access to due process before he was sentenced to death by the constitutional law professor president.
And it's funny because when you look at that issue, even in the courts, we've seen Justice Scalia, who many people think of as conservative, also talk about the fact that you can't have it both ways. Americans have to have some process before they're denied liberty. Definitely an issue that scrambled some political alliances. Thank you for sharing a little bit about your film with us, Jeremy.
Thank you. It's like the Brady Bunch here.
Right.
What does that make you?
It's a story.
Are you daddy?
I'm the unwelcome visitor.
No, you're welcome.
You're always welcome.
You're welcome, and thanks for sharing that with us. Straight ahead.